Good evening, everybody. My name is George A. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a real honor. I've never been on the school. I've always wanted to go to school here. I don't think I would have. I don't think I'd get into school here, which is the other thing. But it's really exciting to be here. So thank you very much for having me. So I'm going to talk about a number of things, particularly design education, a little bit of the work that we do at our studio, and some of the things that I had heard about but not really heard out loud all that much. An early part of my career when I was working at IDEO was to help design these insulin delivery devices that would help people manage their blood glucose levels and essentially through design work cause positive behavior change. Felt pretty good about that kind of work. At a later part in my career, I'm also doing work at IDEO for this guy. I'm designing packaging for the Kool-Aid brand, causing people to consume enormous amounts of sugary water. Do you see the problem here? There is a potential person who is being aided through my design work to change probably their blood glucose levels in a dramatic way over enough time that I'm also helping with this product that I've also worked on within my same career, within potentially the same lifetime. This is the kind of conflict of interest that exists in the design industry, and it's absolutely apparent everywhere, and it took me a long time to realize it. So it came as a bit of a shock, but I thought it'd be helpful to let you know that this is kind of stuff that you see. Depending on who is asking you to do this design work, you may have outcomes that you are not ready to face, or perhaps not really interested in hearing about. But this is very much apparent in the design industry as a whole. The question that I often heard before we started a project was mostly, can we do it? Based around resources, can be around budget, around timing. But the question around, should we do it? I didn't really hear all that much. It was something that I was maybe implied. Perhaps if it was egregious enough, we would definitely have turned it down. But the should we question seemed to be a secondary thought, which I thought was kind of odd. And I don't think I had the clarity to be able to ask this, but when you recognize that level of discrepancy between what you do on one hand and then do on the other, you make yourself feel very uncomfortable, frankly. I felt very powerless in saying anything about what I saw. I also felt that by saying something out loud, I would be jeopardizing my future career. I also think that by saying it out loud, I look like an asshole and I make everyone else look like an asshole, which means that nobody wants to talk about this. Even though everybody knows, bringing it up is a problem. And in many ways, I was left wondering, how can I change anything? This is just baked into the system. So in 2011, my co-founder and I started something called the Greater Good Studio. We created a company, a design company, whose only focus was to do the design work that I felt not only were aligned with values, but were explicitly based upon a social mission, so that there was no confusion about the work that we were going to be doing. And by there not being any confusion, we also wanted to clarify that there was no discrepancy between the public-facing work we would promote and the private work that we did actually when we were back in our studio. It's a terrible business, actually, trying to do businesses like this. It would have been, frankly, much better to have done this, which is incrementally better studio, which we joke about, because there are half the times we go, this would have been so much easier if we'd just done the stuff we had already kind of knew how to do, which was to slightly change things and to be always doing that karmic offset, which I've seen in a lot of design studios, where they do some work for large corporations and then they make themselves feel better because, frankly, it's helpful to doing work that's for a small nonprofit or local organization that needs help, which I totally understand. We just didn't want to do that kind of a business. I am glad to say, though, that after 6 years, we now have a studio of 10. That's a new employee who started just this week, so I haven't had a headshot yet. We're at 10, which is a terrifying full-time employee payroll to make. So I would say that I'd like to not get much bigger than 10. But I know that if you go beyond this type of number, the crushing pressure of having to make payroll might cause us to have to make those compromises that we always said that we didn't want to do. We call ourselves pissed off optimists because I think that is an interesting kind of balance between being upset enough to see the world be different, but hopeful that we can actually do something about it, which I think is something that design does a very good job of, kind of helping you become comfortable with the ambiguity of a lot of these complex issues. But the reason why I think we are still actually in business, this reason for having sort of the 6 years and the ability to actually thrive, is that we developed something called a gut check. We wanted to have something where the idea of saying stuff out loud, like I felt back in IDEO, was the norm, as opposed to the thing that you have to like swallow and bury and hope nobody notices. So we were trying to operationalize our culture, which means that we had to write questions, actual questions out loud, that would help us understand and force ourselves to go through a rigorous system whereby the act of feeling good about something wasn't just a emotional feeling that day, did depend on whether or not I had a good meal, did depend on whether I had coffee that morning. It had to be operationalized, which means that we can consistently have this rigor as opposed to just being in the right mood. Because when we have felt funny about questions, where some of these are up here, I didn't know those questions could be said out loud or asked. I just felt kind of funny about it. We'd have incoming potential projects and we go, I'm not really sure why I like it. And I would not sure how to say no. So this gut check actually allowed me to have rationale behind the no. And I suspect all of you have a gut check, but I don't know if any of you have written it down. I don't know how many people have talked about it out loud, and I don't know if you've developed your own one. I suspect all of you have an innate sense for projects you want to do, projects you love doing, and projects you know you kind of don't want to, but I think because it's all very gut-based and not written down, it's very fluffy. And I think when it's fluffy, you will get exploited. People will use the fluffiness, and you'll feel like, well, I think maybe I should do it because I got to pay rent, or maybe that will get me another project. And you convince yourself that the work you're trying to do will eventually happen because of this work you have to do now. And it's very problematic. So almost despite the fact that we've built this very, very rigorous filter, I'd say we actually have been able to work on about 50 different engagements over the last 6 years with organizations that are tiny, from our next door neighbor all the way through up to the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, who we just started working with late last year. And that spectrum of organizations all rest on this idea that there is a framing that happens at the beginning of our projects. And it's a framing that's almost like a rubric. It goes like this. We want blank to blank. The first blank is we want a personal group of people, as in like a real, somebody we can actually identify, not this fake persona, but someone I can really meet, to now do blank, this actual new behavior. And by writing it down in that way, we clarify and like level set all of our projects. So some examples of that look like, we want middle school age children to smoothly transition into high school. Turns out that's a mess. Does anyone remember transition to high school? Did you have a smooth transition? It can vary, actually. It can really vary. This is what we're trying to do right now in Chicago. Another example is we want adults struggling with weight loss to maintain peer relationships to hold them accountable. We found that the work we were doing with the YMCA really affected your ability to maintain your self-image if you had peers that were also struggling with the same issues and that you all kept yourself in a group that was quite profound, actually. And another example here is we want landlords and tenants to treat their relationships with a long-term view, because there's a lot of landlords and tenants who frankly treat themselves very transactionally, and that can lead to, frankly, not very positive relationships. Yeah, so these are examples of projects we've done, and this is how we start every project. Yeah, so sometimes we'll meet with someone, quite frankly, here's one of the other issues. That I'm meeting with people who have never heard of design, never heard of us, that's for sure, because we're tiny, and have no idea why they would possibly want to use design with the work they do. And if they do, there's no budget for it. It's a nightmare, okay? So in getting past all those issues, once you finally figure out perhaps there may be a natural alignment, what the project might be rests on this. We want to find out who are you trying to affect and what is the behavior change we're trying to cause. And once we get past that first round, we're actually probably a long way towards getting a project framed. The money part I can talk about later, but that's a different type of process. But the framing and the appropriateness of the framing is actually the thing that we focus on the most. And please, if you have questions along the way, just raise your hand. So what we found actually is that by taking the money part, as in the part about where most clients and people who work for money tend to usually get into sticky conversations, when you take that off the table, you actually get a lot of power back. When you talk about what the project should be and what's appropriate, not about how much you get paid, you gain power in that conversation. I never saw that coming. That was a really unusual outcome. You get a lot of credibility and also respect, frankly, when you say, no, I don't think we should do this project together because of X, Y, and Z. And that gut check allowed us to have rationale behind it. What we've been finding is that the projects you say yes to tend to define your portfolio, but the projects you say no to define your reputation. that's the stuff that ends up emanating beyond any sort of website, beyond any sort of actual portfolio. And I didn't think that that was a thing you could actually help script. But it turns out when you say no to a bunch of stuff, somebody might notice. And I will tell you right now, it's still terrifying. I've written personally about 16, maybe 17 personal breakup emails with the, it's not you, it's me, I'm really sorry, we can't do this thing anymore. And we do it at the beginning before we get into projects, because by the time the project starts and the contract's in place, it's totally done. You lose all power by that point. The power comes in setting it up and saying no before the contracts get signed. So in writing those breakup emails, I've had to work out, what am I going to say? I can't sound like this, whiny little, like I'm too good for you. That doesn't come across well. I also don't want to insult anyone because they really do still need some help. So in writing down the no, I'm actually trying to see if there is somebody I know plenty of people in the network who can say, who can I hand you off to because they are better suited for this project. So being respectful of that need is critical. But when you say no, it turns out your reputation kind of becomes that thing, as opposed to it just being something that we talk about. So over this last several years in talking about sort of feeling powerless and then starting to gain power, I realized I don't even have the vocabulary for this kind of conversation. I don't even know if I know how to talk about it. And I was wondering why. Why? I know a lot of stuff about a lot of things, but this is something I'm very clumsy at talking about. And I wondered if perhaps there was a gap somewhere that I had not filled and hadn't spotted. And I actually blamed that on design school. And that design school, I think, does a really good job at one primary thing better than any other discipline. It makes you unbelievably comfortable with ambiguity, which is something that almost every other major discipline, engineering, law, medicine, is deliberately trying to eliminate. They are trained to eliminate ambiguity and narrow and converge because their careers depend on it. Our job as designers has that aspect, but only after there is this wide, expansive phase of exploration. Most other careers and most other disciplines don't have that at all. It's just all about convergence. How lucky are we that we get this bit? But in doing this part, I think that there is something that I found to be a gap. We get trained not only to be comfortable with ambiguity, but to treat things like problems that we are uniquely suited to solve. I get it, we are really good at it as a field, but some of the things that we're talking about now, which is different than maybe 10, 20, 30 years ago, aren't just projects anymore. They're really complex issues. So the more students who are coming out of schools like this wanting to get into the social sector, I think are a little unprepared and are going to be overwhelmed by how complex those issues are when we train them to treat everything like a problem. So what is the big deal? Frankly, most commercial designers in the world of design has been solving for business problems for a long, long time. And that is perfectly appropriate. In fact, that's why a lot of careers exist. But I think when you try to copy-paste the problem-solving methodology from the business world and just try to drop it in the social sector, you'll find, just like we did, embarrassingly enough, you're going to sound like a bozo and you won't get very far. You will treat everyone as though they are lucky to be working with you. And you will oversimplify some of these issues that have taken decades to build up. I cringe at the thought of how many times we sounded like bozos and that we never called calls back from people. And I will never really know how many times we did that. I think we've gotten better, but the idea of talking about this work in a way that is respectful to the people who've done it before took a lot of time to kind of figure out. And again, if you're trying to work out how to solve for a really ergonomic toothbrush, talking to people who did it beforehand, sure, that's a pretty good idea. In fact, doing precedent analysis, all that type of stuff is great. But then you can't reduce, let's say, systemic racism to the same thing that you're doing with this toothbrush. But I tend to think that there are students and schools promoting the idea that this large, complex social issue that's taken decades to build up is just another thing that we have to tackle, like this toothbrush, like this drill, like this business model. And it seems too neat for me. And I think that there's a lot of social sector clients that maybe haven't been able to articulate why they held us off at arm's length for so long, but I think that may be partly why. We don't really understand this stuff about power. It doesn't get talked about in design school, and I think that's a problem. What are some of these issues that we're talking about, these issues that are really complex? Well, there's a bunch of them, right? So this is a list of maybe 50 or so, but in this array, these things, not only are they complex, They took a significant amount of time to get to where they are. They don't neatly fit into a Gantt chart. They don't simply get solved by Post-it notes, as much as I love Post-it notes. So the idea that this is something that will be done in a semester seems to underappreciate the complexity of it. And I think that the social sector clients can tell, but here's the thing, I think they think we know about power, because we get given so much as a person who then works on these projects. Urban planners, folks like us, we get given enormous power. So perhaps the social sector has been kind of wondering, wait, you guys don't cover this in your classes? I thought you did. So I feel like they don't even want to bring it up. So it just seems like this gap that keeps swirling around, and this question of can we do this project versus should we do this project comes up again and again. Is it appropriate for us to be working on this project? I don't know. Has someone else tried this before? Probably yes. Have they struggled with it? Yes. Are you talking to them? Probably no. Because you think that perhaps we've been told we're so awesome at problem solving, why do we need to look at other people who've been struggling for years? Haven't you failed at this for so long? Just wait till you get a load of me. I feel like there's this sense that we are just going to crush this project. And in doing so, perhaps we might be reminding communities and people we're trying to serve, this project can't happen without us. Very scary. So, what is power? Let's see if we can do a quick definition. So I found this to be a really helpful, very, very short definition. It's the ability to affect an outcome. If you have a lot of power, you can practically guarantee certain outcomes to go your way. If you don't have much power, your ability to make an outcome go your way is kind of dicey, maybe 50% at best. Power, and when trying to understand how it works, can profoundly affect your worldview. I found that there is a number of different ways in which power changes how you see the world, that if you haven't experienced it, people with power, typically the people who are writing projects and framing things, have a bit of a cognitive dissonance around. So here's a couple of different ways in which living with power and living without power are different. Your chances of going in your favor, we talked about, are different. Planning time scale is quite different. And also the dominant mindset is different. So I'm going to try and talk about each of these. And this is not scientific, this is just me. If you have a lot of power, the chances of things going in your favor are pretty high. Makes a lot of sense. And the chances in your favor with that much power is pretty low. Okay? If that's your norm, your planning time scale changes. So what that means is that if you can predictably have things go your way pretty consistently, you get used to it, which means you start planning ahead years, decades. If you have enormous amounts of power, you might be planning for your generation and the generations after that. You know there are people who can do that, who are planning for estates, planning for generational wealth to extend because they've never had it challenged. Wouldn't you do that? On the other hand, if you don't have much power, time tends to compress because you can't afford to make a bet that lasts 10 years for it to come through. The time scale may be days, weeks, months at most, because the longer you make a bet, the riskier it is. So if that's your norm, if you're used to working on decade-long planning, your mindset's very rational because things go the way they're meant to. It's really great. It's super great having power. Who wouldn't love to have it? It's so predictable. But when you don't have power and your time scale is short, you tend to act irrationally. Has anyone, for instance, made poor decisions when they've been hungry? Has anyone made like a poor food decision when they're hungry? You actually didn't need to raise your hands, but thanks for outing yourself. I do that all the time. I'm so familiar with making McDonald's decisions based on me being hungry at the time that I'm trying to drive out of the way because I know I will succumb to wanting to eat whatever it is, chicken nuggets. I love chicken nuggets. It's very predictable for me. And I'm a grown-ass man. I should know better. But the irrationality that comes from thinking in a short-term sense is an overriding aspect. And it happens to me and it happens to a lot of people at scale. So when you have a lot of power and you plan for things for people who will live like that, you may not understand because your worldview doesn't look like that. Your worldview is completely different. So you may be planning projects that require people to plan out like this because you're used to it, when that makes no sense because your life is spent doing that. Another concept that I think is helpful to understand is the idea of power asymmetry. Power asymmetry, I think, profoundly affects relationships, but I think it's helpful to understand because you may be subject to it. So has anyone here ever been on a project where you felt from the very beginning, I'm screwed? There's no way I'm going to be able to get this done on time. There's no way I can be successful. The budget is out of whack. I'm toast. And you do it because you feel not only can you not, but also it's just happening to me. That is a feeling of being at the sharp end of power asymmetry. Someone else at the wide end has applied pressure to you. You may not know them. Sadly, you may know them. But in those cases, there is that sharp difference. Power asymmetry means that you have to figure out where you are in that relationship. It's not a fixed state, mind you. It can change. Where you are may be at the wide end at times. Sometimes you're at the sharp end. Some classic relationships that look like this. Funders to their grantees. This is back to your question earlier. Teachers to their students. You know this is true. Parents to their children. Government with the citizens. Employers with employees. Doctors with their patients. Law enforcement with detainees. I still call my parents every week or so, and I feel like I'm subjected to it. Even though I can't get out of it, I feel like I'm stuck. I love them to bits, but I feel like that's set and will be for the rest of my life. I also think that I fall into that role because I'm used to it. Can you think of a relationship you're in where you're in the wide end right now? Is there a relationship you can think of where you're on the sharp end right now? Finding out where you are might help explain some of the mechanics of that relationship. It might help explain why you feel a certain way. And it may explain why you keep doing it in that particular manner, because you may feel stuck. So because we know that that exists, power asymmetry is so present in every relationship, unless you deliberately design the transfer of power, we will fall back into that same rhythm again. So we talked a little, actually, you brought up a good point, the idea of not working with Robert Johnson, now working with Robert Johnson. We are incredibly honored to be working with Robert Johnson, don't get me wrong. And it's actually, I think it's a massive percentage of it happens because we have this particular relationship with this amazing program officer called Katie Weir. She's an unusually expansive thinker for a foundation, I'd say. And she helped us understand this project that we call raisingplaces.org. It's a community-led process where we're working with 6 communities across the country to help design a child-centered community. And what that means is that we're helping help a community define their geographic boundaries, what assets they have, what challenges they face, who is on the design team. They are driving all of it. We're merely guiding them. But in doing so, we knew that there had to be at most 6 final selected communities, but we weren't sure how many people would actually apply. So we realized, man, if 10 communities apply, 10 out of those 6, then there's at least 4 that are completely wasting their time. If there's 20 organizations, there's 14 who have completely wasted their time. If there's 100, 94 organizations, and all of the cumulative man hours that's spent putting this application together will be completely wasted. We've seen it happen again and again and again with a lot of funders. So Robert Johnson to grantees, that makes sense. They're on the wide end, they're on the sharp end. But because we got given a grant and we were choosing communities, we're like there. We're not quite as big as these guys, and we never will be, but we're definitely on the wide end. And we have to call that out. So what we found is that when those grantees turn into communities, we have to find a way in which we actually have the process of applying not strip people of power. So what that meant was that we actually designed a complete workshop and a whole series of very lightweight tasks that applicants would go through where they gained power and understanding in the community if they never got in. We even had one community complete the exercise and write to us to say, this has been really helpful, we got convenings together, we realized we're actually not ready to do this project, we are turning you down, peace out. So awesome, that's so cool. They had enough power to turn us down, that is brilliant. We were so not only proud of them, we were like, that's amazing. I've never heard that before. So I don't think it's like a perfect process, but the idea that we were trying to not let that kind of abuse happen was something we had to be really intentional about, because we know it's happened again and again and again, and there's no one telling us to do so. Robert Wood Johnson's actual application process is built to be like this. Not that they're trying to be abusive, but it's just built to not have power transfer built in. It's just meant to be a fat end to a sharp end. So we struggled in designing their own application process to have that transfer built in. And we really struggled with their internal operations team to make it happen. But they were really very kind to us because they understood what we were trying to do. So all this to say is that when we are trying to do our design work and we do this deliberate transfer, it has to be thoughtfully done from the very beginning. It has to be implemented and designed into the project itself. Otherwise, you may find that communities you're working with may feel as though this project is going to happen regardless of their input, regardless of what you do, what they say, and it will just happen to them. Sadly, there's enough precedent in the past from other projects that has happened where they may, let's say, you may be suffering from a trust deficit going into a relationship where they have no reason to trust you. So because of that, you need to be explicit about what your goals are, explicit about what the expectations can be, and explicit about how we're going to leave you not less, but more than you started. So a general thesis we've had at our studio for so long is just the idea that people adopt the change that they were a part of making. And if you design opportunities for people to be a part of that process, they will more likely adopt the change as opposed to have it mandated to them. And that adoption is the difference, I think, between seeing projects go okay to possibly well and possibly the norm, which is something that we aspire to do. And that change process can be designed, it turns out. And I think that's the kind of work that we're trying to do at our studio.